Thank you, and good morning. Well, as Christine mentioned, I do research on teacher supply, demand, and quality issues and have been for the last couple of decades. And today I want to talk just a bit about what I found about this huge problem that we continually hear so much about. That's the teacher shortage, and particularly the mathematics and science teacher shortage. Well, as we've heard so many times, we have this crisis, and it's a result of two large demographic trends. We have an increase in student enrollments, and we have an increase in teacher retirements, and these two trends are colliding, and voila, schools are having serious problems finding qualified people, particularly in subjects like math and science, to fill all their positions. Widespread crisis. The antidote is straightforward. We don't have enough teachers, let's get more of them. And so, of course, as we've heard, we have dozens and dozens of very interesting initiatives in this country, federal level, state level, local level, all designed to bring more people, particularly math and science, into the teaching occupation. So we have alternative certification, and we have troops to teachers, and we have signing bonuses, and we have student loan forgiveness, and states like Massachusetts make national headlines with signing bonuses and things like this. Some districts recruit overseas. All perhaps very worthwhile things to do. Some of them, of course, cost more money than others. But after looking at the data over a long period of time, I've come to the conclusion that although all these recruitment efforts may be very worthwhile things to do, they will not alone solve the problem. They simply will not work. And at a close look at the data, I've come to the conclusion that to understand these staffing problems that plague so many schools, we have to sort of stop looking at these large demographic trends out there and start looking more in the way schools organized, operate, managed, etc. And after doing that, I've come to the conclusion, something of a heretical conclusion, that the conventional wisdom about teacher shortages is really something of a set of wrong diagnoses and a set of wrong prescriptions. Well, first, just a quick word on my data that I use. These are national data. 3 data sets I've used: Schools and Staffing Survey. This is the largest source of information on teachers that exists. The Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, otherwise known as IPEDS, extensive data on higher ed, and the Baccalaureate and Beyond Survey, which takes a college cohort and follows them for a number of years. What do these data tell us about this whole teacher shortage? Well, first, the data tell us that in some respects, the conventional wisdom is indeed correct. Student enrollments have been going up and continue to go up. Teacher retirements are going up. Demand for teachers has no question about it increased. In any given year, the majority of schools in this country are hiring elementary and secondary teachers. And most important, the data tell us that yes, it is true. Significant numbers of schools out there do indeed have difficulty filling their positions with qualified people. And I've quantified that a bit in this slide, and I apologize if those in the back might have trouble seeing it. What these bars on this slide show us is the percentage of secondary schools that have vacancies. That's the light blue bar. And the dark blue bar is the percentage of all secondary schools that tell us that they've had serious difficulties filling those vacancies. And mathematics, note, is at the top. Science is a little further down. I've divided it between physical and life science. But also note that there's significant numbers of schools that have these hiring difficulties, and no field is at the majority. It's not every school out there we're talking about. After that, though, I find that conventional wisdom and data start to diverge. The key question here is, well, how much supply do we have, and is it sufficient or is it not? And how do we quantify that? How do we measure that? Well, first, let's just talk for a moment here about where the new hires do come from, the sources of new hires in this country. And I've divided it up on the left side there, that large pie chart. And there's 3 sources. Interestingly enough, the majority of new hires in schools in any given year are actually people that were teaching in another school. That's the green portion of that pie chart. We call them movers. That's over half. Of the new supply, the next largest piece is what we call the reserve pool. That's the black part. And I've taken that black part, the reserve pool, and on the right subdivided it between the two camps, the two components of it. You have people that taught for a while and left, and so ostensibly they're out there and they're hireable. They're a qualified part of the pool. And then there's people that prepared to become teachers and never did it. We call them delayed entrants. And significant numbers of these people from this reserve pool out there come into teaching every year. Of course, we have no way of knowing how big that reserve pool is. All the former teachers, all the would-be teachers who are qualified. We can assume, though, that it's very, very large. Finally, the smallest piece of the new hires is that yellow portion of the pie chart. That's what we call the pipeline. That's what we produce. Those are the people coming fresh out of colleges, departments, and schools of education. That's actually the smallest piece of the new hires in any given year, which is interesting because usually we assume that is the supply. It is the part, however, that we can quantify. And so let's go back to that question. Is the new supply sufficient? And how do we actually assess that? Well, one way is you see if there's sufficient numbers of newly prepared teachers, say from that pipeline, to cover your losses, for instance, from retirement. And that's what I've done in this next slide here. These are ratios, and they show us a ratio of the new supply coming in just from colleges and teacher preparation programs divided by the number of teachers that left in that same year. And so if the number is larger than 1, that means we have more supply than we had retirees. If the number is less than 1, it means that we don't have enough supply to cover the losses from retirement. Interestingly enough, what these bars show us, and I've broken it down, the top bar is all teachers, the second bar is English teachers, and then we have science and math. Math is the one at the bottom, is to show it that even in science and math, and this is completely against conventional wisdom, in this country we actually produce enough new people from colleges of education to cover our losses from retirement. In each of those cases, the number is greater than 1, the ratio. Even in mathematics, we produce twice as many new math teachers as what we lose in any given year from retirement. However, the picture changes when we look at all those who quit teaching for other than retirement reasons, pre-retirement teacher turnover. So the bottom set here, same kind of ratios. This is supply from the pipeline over all those who quit in that same year. And a very different picture emerges. And what the data tell us is that in fields like English, we produce more than enough new people to cover all those leaving, retirement and other reasons. But in science and mathematics, the two bottom bars, it's a much tighter fit. Indeed, more quit than what we produce from colleges of education in science and math. We have a problem there. But look where this problem lies. The data tell us that most of the demand for new hires at the beginning of any given school year actually has little to do with student enrollment increases and teacher retirement increases. Most of those hired at the beginning of any given school year are simply to replace those who left 3 months before at the end of that prior school year. And most of those who left at the end of that prior school year did not do so because of retirement and gray hair, pre-retirement teacher turnover. That's the missing piece here. That's the piece that hasn't been recognized fully. That's what makes it tough here. So let's just look for a few minutes at what about the turnover of teachers and a little bit of the data. This shows us trends across time, annual teacher turnover in the last 15 years or so, and I've broken it down by English and science and mathematics. And what these data tell us is that couple things. First of all, hasn't changed much over time. It's somewhere around 16% a year. That there's not big differences between different fields. Mathematics and science teachers don't necessarily have a lot higher teacher turnover than others. There's something else that I need to mention about this. There's two pieces to these bars. There's two components. There's what we call movers. Those are people that move from one school to another. And the second part is what we call leavers, those who get out of teaching altogether. Now, this is an unusual thing for a researcher to do. Traditionally, people haven't really paid much attention to those cross-school movers, those who quit one school and they go to another school. Maybe it's down the street, maybe it's another state. And their logic went like this. Well, if a teacher's going from one school to another, even if it's another state, they're still part of the system. There's no net loss here in our supply of teachers. So it's not really a problem. Who cares about it? You know, it's not contributing to shortages in a systemic sense. And that's true. That's true. It's not. But this gets back to the old level of analysis, the perspective we take, which so bedevils researchers. Because, of course, from a systemic viewpoint, it doesn't matter if someone's moving to another school, they're still in the system. However, from the viewpoint of the school or the district, it does indeed matter. In other words, if you're a school principal, it doesn't do any good to say, look, it doesn't really matter to say to that principal, look, whether you're quitting teaching to become a banker or a professor or a homemaker, or whether you're moving to a school 10 minutes down the road, you're still part of the staffing problem, the shortages for that principal. So in other words, at the organizational level, movers do indeed matter. And they certainly matter empirically, because if we didn't include those in, these bars would be about half the size of what they really are. Some people move between buildings, some people get out of the occupation. Both of them are forms of turnover. Now, the other thing that I need to mention that's almost always forgotten in discussions of these staffing problems in the teaching occupation is that there's a lot of teachers. Teaching is one of the largest occupations in the country. There's over twice as many teachers as nurses. There's over 5 times as many teachers as either professors or lawyers. Teaching is a very, very large occupation. Census tells us it's the largest one. I don't know if that's true or not. And so if you take that simple fact that teaching, elementary and secondary teaching, is a very large group, and you combine it with these annual turnover rates, you end up with a very striking scenario. This is an occupation with a great deal of movement of people into, between, and through buildings. And I've tried to capture that in this slide. These are just the math and science teachers. And the yellow arrow on the top left there, 65,000 teachers. These are math science teachers who came into schools at the beginning of that 99-2000 school year. This is just one given year. Then the green arrow on the right side, these are those who left schools, math science teachers who left schools. Notice a slightly larger number, 68,000, maybe 10 months later. What this slide tells us, what it illustrates to us, is that a third, over 100,000 math science teachers, out of a math science teaching force of 400,000, over a third are in job transition each and every year, moving into, between, or out of schools. When we take this as a teaching force as a whole, the amounts are similar. It turns out that there's over 1 million teachers moving into, between, or out of schools each and every year. There's a great deal of job transition in this occupation. This turnover really adds up. There's a tremendous amount. And the term we often use to describe this kind of scenario in a given line of work or profession or occupation is the revolving door. Teaching, and math science teachers in this case, are characterized as a revolving door occupation. There's a lot of movement. Now, there's no assumption here that all this turnover, this attrition, this moving, this quitting, whatever we want to call it, is bad. Certainly not. We don't want 100% retention. We want some people to leave. Some people should not be teachers. Turns out that the whole question of employee turnover is a very, very big topic in schools of business, particularly management departments. There's a great, great deal of interest in employee turnover. And there's a huge body of empirical research on this. I tried to do a search and I just gave up after 3,000 hits of empirical studies of employee departures and turnover and attrition in one occupation or profession or another. And there's a general consensus in this literature that the good firm, the good organization, the good workplace actually promotes and benefits from some degree of employee turnover. You want some people to leave, etc. You want fresh blood to come in. Yeah, so it's not all bad. On the other hand, there's a general consensus amongst those who study this that high levels of employee turnover are not cost-free. They have all kinds of consequences and costs. And in fact, I've had colleagues who have gotten fancy consulting contracts to figure up down to the dollar, some complicated algorithm of what are the costs of employee turnover in a given industry, the insurance industry, something like that. Because management wants to know. Because management understands that it affects the bottom line. That if they have a particular operation and it's losing 30% of its people a year, that's a red flag. There is one industry, quote unquote, however, who's never seemed to pay much attention to its high rates of employee turnover: elementary and secondary schools. There's been very little recognition of this, almost as if sort of a revolving door was a natural fact of life and it's okay, almost as if it was cost-free. And start to think about the potential costs of having a revolving door in a school. I mean, to me, the most interesting consequences are probably those that don't affect just the costs of replacing, the more easily measured and quantifiable costs. Think of the effect on classrooms and students and teacher morale. I mean, suppose that you've just gotten a whole grant and you've put together a new social studies curriculum in your social studies department and a couple key people leave. I mean, it's like money's just wasted. Or I know that these costs have been recognized more increasingly by foundations in terms of long-term investments in school reform, that there's a recognition that you need buy-in, you need participation from teachers for these reform efforts to work. But if key people leave halfway through, it could completely undermine a lot of the money spent. And I think it's important to recognize the costs and consequences of employee turnover, in this case, teacher turnover, because as you probably have guessed, the rate at which the revolving door revolves varies. It varies amongst different types of teachers, and it varies amongst different types of schools. And it moves particularly quickly in those first few years. These are rough estimates where I've tried to quantify cumulative attrition. I'm not counting movers here. These are just people getting out of teaching, getting out of schools in the first few years. These are rough estimates, and the data tell us that after 1 year, about 12% of those who've come into teaching are gone. After 3 years, it's something just under a third. And after 5 years, you've lost between 40 and 50% of those who came in. Now, there's some who say these figures are an exaggeration. I think there's some truth to that. And they say that because, well, look, we know a lot of these people do come back. They're not leaving permanently. They're stepping out to have children or go to graduate school or try another job for a while, and that is true. In fact, we've been able to measure that a little bit. This next slide is the same as the prior one, except for the blue portion of the bar is those who tell us they've left in the first few years, but they tell us that they would strongly consider returning. And you can see it's a significant part. So in other words, teaching's an occupation with very high losses in the first few years, but a bunch of these losses are not permanent. They're temporary. So the supply's still there. In a sense, they become part of that reserve pool out there waiting to be enticed back in. But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. Let's go back to the old level of analysis, the perspective. Because, of course, from the principal's perspective, it doesn't really help to say, look, particularly if you're teaching, say, required math or science courses, to say, look, I'm going to quit, and I'll be back in 2 years. Could you hold my position for me? In other words, even if it's temporary loss, it still has some consequences for these staffing problems that so plague schools. And the other thing here is that we got to break this up. It turns out that the revolving door, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear this, it varies in its rate of revolution amongst different types of schools. And I've tried to illustrate that in this slide, showing a range here. And again, I apologize for those in the back, you maybe can't see it, but the top bar is all the public schools. And then the second bar, these are large suburban not poor schools. And on average, they're losing about 10% of their full-time teachers a year in this country, moving and leaving both. At the bottom, we have small urban poor schools, and on average, they're losing 2.5 times as much as those large suburban not poor schools. They're losing over a quarter, on average, of their full-time people every year. And of course, that's just an average. When we go into specific school districts, we'll find some buildings lose less than 10% of their teachers a year. Other buildings are losing 30 to 40% of their teachers every year. There's very large differences in these outflows of teachers amongst different types of schools. And that's a key finding, because that brings up what to me is the key question here. And that's the why question. Why? Why is there so much moving and leaving, turnover in this occupation? And more specifically, why is it that some schools have so much more of it than others? And to me, this is a key question, because if we don't get the diagnosis down, we'll never get the prescriptions right. That these outflows of teachers are a big part of the shortages. They are a big part of the demand for new teachers. And we need to understand why. And I've spent a lot of time over the last decade looking at data from principals, looking at data from teachers, fancy statistical analyses, etc. And what I'm going to present are a little bit of what we call self-report data. Quite analogous to the concept of the exit interview, which is common in corporate America. What better way to find out why some of your employees have moved to your competition or have quit the occupation? You ask them. Of course, we know there's some validity issues. Some employees may not feel that they can entirely be frank, particularly if they need a good reference letter from their former employee. But in this case, it's an anonymous national survey of teachers who have moved from or left their schools. And I've broken it down by field. The top bar is non-math science teachers, the middle bar is science teachers, and the bottom bar is math teachers. And these are percentage of teachers, all the teachers who have moved and left, who gave a particular reason why they did so. And the findings are very interesting. The top set is retirement. Somewhere around 13–14% of these large flows of teachers out of buildings, the teachers tell it's retirement. This is a very significant finding. Why? Because it's so small. We have been told again and again and again that there's this gray hair crisis in teaching. There's this retirement crisis, and that this is the major factor behind the shortages, and the shortages in turn are the major factor behind so much of the performance problems in schools, etc. And what do the data tell us? Yes, retirement is a piece, and it's significant. In fact, it's increasing too. But it's so much smaller than some of the other reasons for these flows of teachers out of buildings. The second set, school staffing actions, I call them. These are building closed, involuntary transfers, people laid off, people fired, those kinds of things. Those are a smaller piece. The middle set, family or personal. These are, I moved from or left my school because I wanted to raise babies, I needed to care for elderly folks, I had health concerns, my spouse moved to another state. Reasons of life. There's nothing neither good or bad about these reasons to leave a workplace. Every occupation has this kind of outflow, and you can see it's significant here. Interesting, it's a little higher for science and math teachers than others. I don't know why that is. The last two sets of bars are the ones that interest me the most as a researcher. The fourth set there, I moved from or left my school because I wanted to pursue another job, a better career, those kinds of reasons. And then the last set, I think of this as the flip side, is I moved from or left my job because I did not like it. I was dissatisfied. Notice that bottom set, dissatisfaction, is the largest set of reasons in the whole chart. If you take those two last ones combined, I think of them as a flip side. I moved or left because I wanted to pursue a better job, or I was dissatisfied. If I combine those two, they account for well over half of the large outflow of teachers from schools every year. Both are far larger than retirement. The very bottom bar, 57% of mathematics teachers who move from or left their schools tell us that a major reason is dissatisfaction. That's a very significant number. And that raises a question. Dissatisfied with what? What's the gripe here? I'm a former high school teacher. I could, if I just went through and all the things that me and my colleagues griped about, it'd be a long, long list. This could be all over the map. And in fact, the survey, the data asks these teachers, well, just what things were you dissatisfied and not dissatisfied, or what things were you satisfied with and not satisfied with? And what was interesting to me, and this is very surprising, was that it wasn't all over the map. In fact, in this large survey, there was quite a bit of consensus that coalesced, around a small subset of things about schools. There may be lots of things teachers have gripes with, but gripes that are linked to saying, I'm going to leave this building or I'm going to leave teaching. And here are the top ones in this next slide. Did I hit that correctly? Just waiting for this next slide here. Can I get any help back there? Any way we can get to that next slide? Let's see, let me remember what that next slide said. Yes. Reasons for dissatisfaction. It's not up yet, but let me do this from memory. Working conditions. The biggest one, as I recall, looking at my notes here, too little preparation time. 2/3 of teachers, and very little difference between science teachers and math teachers and other teachers, indicated that too little preparation time was a major reason for their dissatisfaction. The second leading reason was too heavy teaching load. These are both very related to one another, somewhere around 50%. Coming in third was poor salary or benefits. 60% of mathematics teachers indicated that poor salary or benefits was a major source of dissatisfaction for them. Fourth was class sizes. Class sizes too large. The fifth was student behavioral problems. Around 50% of the different types of teachers indicated that student discipline behavioral problems were a major source of dissatisfaction behind their moving or leaving. And when I give talks on this sometimes to legislators, they'll say, well, okay, that makes sense. If there's a lot of, here we are, thank you. So, too little preparation time is the top one, then too heavy teaching load. Poor salary or benefits is the third set there. Class size is too large. Student behavioral problems is second to the bottom. And as I was saying, usually there'll be someone who'll say, look, okay, this is a no-brainer. Obviously, if there's a lot of strife and conflict and student discipline problems in a school, you're going to have some teachers moving on or getting out of teaching entirely. But gosh, Dr. Ingersoll, what can you really do about that? I mean, isn't that kind of an unfortunate fact of life, particularly for a high school teacher, that we just don't make kids as well behaved as when we were kids? And they're rough, and, there's a decline in respect for authority, and the argument goes on and on like that. We've all heard that, and I had to think about that for a while. That sort of made sense. But then I discovered a very, very interesting thing in the data. It turns out that schools vary dramatically in how much of a student discipline and student behavioral problems they have. Some schools do a far better job of coping with it than do other schools. And I found out that poverty is by no means the only factor here. And then the data indicate that those schools that do significantly better in coping with their student discipline behavioral issues have far, far better teacher retention. So that's a very different outcome. Rather than saying, kids are rough, so be it, it's just going to be a fact of life for high school teachers that they're going to have to put up with a certain amount of verbal and even physical abuse. Rather than say that, we see, oh my gosh, here we have places that don't put up with that and don't have that, even in inner city. And so the data point in a much more optimistic direction. What we want to do is find out, well, those places that do a good job of both dealing with their student discipline problems and retaining their teachers, let's look more closely at them. Finally, the last one at the bottom here, lack of faculty influence, where again you have significant numbers, particularly science teachers, indicate that this was a major source of dissatisfaction for them. And this is the issue of how much say and input do teachers have in the building over the key decisions that affect their day-to-day work. And once again, the data tell us that schools vary dramatically. All the way from, one extreme, we have maybe sort of a top-down command and control model with, principal as the boss, so to speak, all the way over to something that's much more of a collegial, shared decision-making model of governance. Schools vary dramatically, and the data tell us that those schools in which teachers have more input, which of course is one of the hallmarks of being a professional, have significantly better teacher retention. So, let's just back up here and think what these data are telling us. They're telling us that there's a whole bunch of aspects of schools that are what we call policy amenable. It's not easy to change these things, but ostensibly these are things that we could have some action on, we could impact in some way. Let's compare that to the conventional wisdom. Recall, the conventional wisdom is sort of a demography is destiny kind of viewpoint. We have these demographic trends out there. Student enrollment increases. Well, that's births. Can't do much about that. Teacher retirement increases. Well, unfortunately, ultimately, that's deaths. We do pass away eventually. Gosh, these demographic external things are causing shortages. What can I do? That's sort of the conventional wisdom. Think what a different direction these data are pointing. The problem isn't so much out there. I mean, of course, demographics these are big factors. But so much of the problem is in here, in the sense that it has to do with the way schools are run and operated and managed. So let me just close by going back to the conventional wisdom. Everyone believes that we have this teacher shortage, and it's due to these two large trends. And we have dozens and dozens of very interesting initiatives, clever initiatives, to bring more people into the occupation. Some of them more expensive than others. All perhaps very worthwhile things to do. But I think the data are telling us that alone they will not do it. They will not solve the problem. In plain terms, the problem isn't solely or even primarily shortages in the sense that we're making too few new teachers. Rather, the problem is also turnover in the sense that we're losing far too many long before retirement. And so the solution cannot simply be recruitment. The solution also has to include retention. There's nothing wrong with recruitment at all. We need to train and recruit more math science teachers. But it's not going to really solve the problem if we lose 40% of them within 5 years. So, in the 2006 State of the Union address, President Bush announced an initiative to recruit 30,000 new math science teachers. That's terrific. But these national data collected by the U.S. Department of Education, when I analyze them, they tell us that each year we lose 45,000 math science teachers, of which only about 10,000 is retirement. A whole lot of that is dissatisfaction. And so, you know, in plain terms, we can bring in hundreds of thousands of new people in the occupation. We want to do that. But if we lose so many, particularly in those first few years, it's not going to solve the problem. The image that always comes to my mind is pouring water in the bucket with holes in the bottom, the leaky bucket image. You just got to keep pouring and pouring and pouring all the time just to stay even. Nothing wrong with pouring, but the data are suggesting, I think, that we also need to get some mud and plug some of those holes in the bottom of the leaky bucket. So, what's the bottom line? Just to close. I think the data are telling us that if we could go out and improve as a nation some of those working conditions in schools, and it's not just salaries, all kinds of other things, then we could slow down the rate of the revolving door, particularly in those schools that have a fast revolving door. And we could spend less money on the huge recruitment efforts to feed the revolving door. I mean, the amount of human personnel department time it takes in a big city district just to keep feeding the revolving door, which is not cost-free. And we could do a lot. It's not a panacea, but I think we could do a lot to solve these so-called teacher shortage crisis. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. Now, I understand we do not have time for Q&A, so I'll be up here if anyone wants to ask questions. And for those who might like further information, I do have a bunch of things on my web page, and also on your right corner of the stage over here, I have some copies, if anyone might like, of a short article summarizing this research. Thank you.